welcome back to Just Another Stitch. For those that don't know me, my name is Connie, and if you're new to my channel, I'd like to welcome you. And if you are new, let me know in the comments down below. Let me know how you found out about my channel, and let me know a little bit about yourself so I can start to get to know you better. So how are all of my Yorny aliens doing today? I hope y'all are all having an amazing day. So, first off, I am not doing a Knitting Friday video this week. I have not gotten any knitting done lately. So instead, I am going to share some helpful knitting knowledge with y'all today. And this is something that I have been asked to do for quite some time. So here it is. It's how to read a knitting pattern. That's what we're going to be talking about. And I know if you're not experienced with reading a knitted pattern, it looks confusing, doesn't it? It really looks like it's a foreign language. So first, I'm going to show you some things on my computer, things to be familiar with in patterns. So I'm going to show you that part right now. Okay, so this is one of my pattern designs, and I want to point out a few things that you will typically see when you read a pattern. If there's any sizing information, that will probably be listed. Like this is a hat pattern. I listed that it's an adult size hat pattern. You'll see materials needed. So I list what weight yarn you will need, the colors that I used, what size knitting needles you need, and also that you need a tapestry needle. Then they'll usually have the gauge listed. And this is very important when it comes to sizing with patterns, because people have different tensions. And sometimes you may need to make an adjustment with what size needle you use, things like that. Where here, the gauge I have here is 20 stitches and 24 rows. And that's doing a 4-inch swatch done in Stockinette Stitch. And I also added the measurements to about how tall and wide the beanie should measure. So you may see that something like that mentioned in a pattern too. And then you will always have your abbreviations, or at least most patterns do. And as you see, STS, that means stitches. K means knit, P means purl. KFB is knit front and back. And sometimes you'll also see patterns include a description of the stitch. You tend to see that typically done like when it's not like the common stitches that you see all the time. Like in knitting, usually, everyone tends to know what a knit and a purl stitch is. So if you use another stitch, sometimes they'll explain how that stitch is worked. But I personally find the best way to learn a stitch is watching a video tutorial. Then you'll have notes sometimes on a pattern. Like here I put, be careful not to pull the yarn tight as the color work is knitted to avoid bunching up of the stitches. And because this pattern uses different color yarn and you'll need to switch the colors, I make abbreviations for the colors. Like Master MC is deep red, C1 is white, C2 is black. And that's important when you do this pattern, because like in this row I have purl and master color, MC, sorry, purl and MC. And without this information up here, you won't know what MC means, or knit 2 in C1, Well, you won't know what C1 is. And that's where it's coded. And I have the colors listed here. And another thing too, like sometimes you will see in patterns, you may see a graph, a chart, like you do in this pattern. So those are things to just kind of be familiar with in a pattern. Like I said, every pattern is different, but you always want to read the top information on a pattern before you get started. Always read that section. It's very important. Okay, so with knitting patterns, you will see a lot of abbreviations. And it just keeps things where you can write stuff up where it's shorter. It's not so much to write. And like for instance, the knit stitch, it's abbreviated K. The purl stitch is abbreviated P. And I am including a link for a website that shows all the abbreviations for knitting. So if you want to get familiar with abbreviations, which I highly advise, that link is in the description box down below for you. So with knitting, you have two ways that you typically work knitting. You have what's called flat knitting and what's called working in the round. So this is what I mean by flat knitting. I'm going to show you my peacock shawl. And you see how it does not connect. That is flat knitting. It works flat. Now, when it comes to working in the round, this is more typically done, hats and beanies especially. And this is what's meant by working in the round. It connects. It makes a tubular shape. Where, you know, everything's connected. That is working in the round. And when it comes to making like beanies and socks, there are methods to do that with flat knitting. With knitting, there are multiple ways to do pretty much everything. And that's where some of the confusion lies with knitting. So with flat knitting, if you're doing a small project, like maybe a dishcloth, a headband, or a scarf, you can use straight needles. They can have a point. This is double pointed right here. But they don't have to have a point on both sides. Because sometimes you have like a little knobby type thing at the end of one side. Now, where you knit from, you want a point there. That has to have a point. But yeah, this is what you would use like for small projects if you go this route. Now, if you're doing something larger, like a shawl or like a blanket, poncho, you're going to need circular knitting needles. And this is what a circular knitting needle looks like. And you have a cord on them. And that basically gives you enough room for all your stitches. So you'll see cords different shapes. Some are smaller than this, some are longer. But like you would use this like for shawls, like right here. I have to use my circular knitting needles. And really, I really use my circular knitting needles for basically everything. Because what you do on double pointed, on straight needles, you can basically do everything on your circulars. The only time I use my double pointed needles is decreases on hats. But yeah, this is what the circulars look like. And with circulars, you have what's called interchangeable knitting needles, which is what I have here, where the needles come undone and I can put another size knitting needle on it. Now you can purchase them where, you know, it's just one needle. you can't detach the needles, where you just have to keep buying a separate needle for each size. So that's some little input about circular needles. Another thing too is when you work in the round, you need circular knitting needles. You have to have them for working in the round. Now there is a magic loop method too, and you can also use like your double pointed needles. There's a method with that, but usually a lot of times you mostly see the circulars when it comes to knitting in the round. So our focus today when it comes to reading patterns is going to be when it comes to flat knitting. And like I said, flat knitting and knitting in the round, things are done differently. So when it comes to casting on your stitches in a pattern, you have the option on if you use a slip knot or not. I don't use slip knots usually whenever I cast on, but like say a pattern tells you to cast on 16 stitches. If you use a slip knot, that slip knot counts as your first stitch, and then you would do 15 more stitches. But if you don't use a slip knot, you would just cast on 16 stitches. So that's very important. If you use a slip knot, it counts as a stitch when knitting cast-ons. And with casting on, you have several different methods. A lot of patterns will say to use your preferred method. I think the most popular preferred method is the long tail cast on, but if it tells you you can use your preferred method or it doesn't specify, you can choose your method. But some patterns will specify a specific method, and if they do, you need to use that method or things just won't look right. So that is one thing to keep in mind. And like I said, when you're doing stockinette stitch, say you have a pattern for stockinette stitch, and if you don't know what stockinette looks like, well, I'll show you on my beanie here, even though this, like I said, this is done in the round, but stockinette always has the same look. But you see how you see the little V's? That is the stockinette stitch. Okay? That's what stockinette looks like. So, the way a pattern is worded with a stockinette stitch is, it'll say something like row 1, and then you'll see or S, which means right side. And then it says knit. And when you do the stockinette stitch, you have a right and the wrong side. Typically, your right side is your odd number rows, like row 1, row 3, row 5. Your wrong side is your even numbers, like 2, 4, 6. And with stockinette stitch, when you typically, if you do the when you do knit stitches, that's your right side. When you do purl stitches, that's your wrong size. And one thing I always do whenever I knit, I always use a stitch marker to mark the right side. So that's something very important to keep in mind. But yeah, so that's how you'll see like row 1 written. And then row 2 will have WS purl. And like I said, I have that right on the screen for y'all, or somewhere on the screen to see how it's written. And basically, you repeat those rows. And you're always going to end on the wrong side. That's going to be your final row. And so your last row should be purls. Some patterns will tell you to do that like for so many inches. And basically what you do is Well, first off, you should have it laying flat. But I'm holding it up for the, you know, it's easier to show y'all this way. But you would have this laying down flat, like on a table. And you always want to put your measuring tape under, right underneath, like the needle or cord section when you're measuring. And then you just measure until you get to like however long it's supposed to be. But yeah, you don't, when you're measuring, you don't want to go from the needle like this. You want it like under or under the cord. Now with stockinette stitch, you actually have what's called a reverse stockinette stitch, which basically is the opposite, where the purl side is the right side and the knit side is the wrong side. So keep that in mind, but I don't think I've really ever had to do that in a pattern. So when it comes to stockinette stitch, like I said, you have one row of knit stitches, you turn your work, the other row is a row of purl stitches. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the garter stitch and flat knitting. And let's see. Okay, you see this gray section right here, how it looks like little wiggly lines? That is your garter stitch. And basically, garter stitch is so easy in flat knitting. You're just doing knit stitches on every row. That is your garter stitch. So, say a pattern tells you to cast on 16 stitches. It will say something like row 1, knit. And it may tell you repeat row 1 until piece measures like 6 inches. So that's typically how you'll see that written up. Or it may say something like row 1 to 15 knit. But yeah, that's how garter stitch works. And garter stitch is reversible. So if you're doing a pattern that's all garter stitch, it really doesn't matter about the right or wrong side. It's reversible. But if you do any other type of stitching with it, the right and wrong side do matter. Next, I want to talk about asterisks, parentheses, and brackets that you'll see in patterns. And basically, an asterisk is a series of steps that are repeated several times across a row. They're used for repeats. And I highly advise using stitch markers. Like for instance, this has a lot of repeats to it. See how I have the stitch marker? That marks the repeat. So, like say that the end of the repeat is a purl stitch. And I get to the end of that row and it's not working out that way, I made a boo-boo. And it alerts me a lot faster. So stitch markers help you keep on track. And it is, like when you're doing repeats, it's so easy to miscount somewhere, or you accidentally do the wrong stitch somewhere along the line. So yeah, repeats, use stitch markers, especially if you're a beginner. Okay, so an example of this, ribbing patterns tend to use them. And I'll show you what ribbing looks like. Again, this is not flat, this is in the round, but it looks the same way if you're flat knitting. The thing is that like what you call a stitch, it looks the same way, but with flat and knitting in the round, it's worked differently. But this gray section, the brim, that is a rib stitching, and you will see variations to it. Some are wider, some are narrower, But where you see the little V's, let me show you better. Like this section here, where my finger is, that's your stockinette portion, and the little wiggly lines, that is your garter stitch portion. Okay, so you have a pattern. It tells you cast on 20 stitches. Row 1 will typically read something to the effect of asterisk, knit 2, purl 2, repeat from asterisk across, and knit 2. And what this means is you'll knit 2 stitches, then you purl 2 stitches, then you knit 2 stitches again, you purl 2 stitches, and you just keep repeating knit 2 stitches, purl 2 stitches, until you come across those last 2 stitches. Those last 2 stitches, you would knit 2 stitches. Very easy. And then row 2 would be written asterisk, P2, purl 2, K2, repeat from asterisk, and purl 2. And that means you would do 2 purl stitches, 2 knit stitches, 2 purl stitches again, 2 knit stitches. And you just keep doing purl 2, knit 2, until you get to the last 2 stitches, and then you would do 2 purl stitches. And basically, when you do that, okay, on that second row, what you're doing is you're purling the stitches that on the previous row you knitted, and then you're knitting the stitches that you previously on the previous row purled. So that's how that works. And some patterns will say to knit the knit stitches and purl the purl stitches, and that's what they mean. I know it's kind of confusing, but like I said, your purl stitches from the previous row now look like knit stitches, and your knit stitches now look like purl stitches. But I do find that's confusing. So usually the best way is you do the opposite of what you did on the first row. So now we're going to talk about brackets, and they're also used to enclose a group of stitches that are repeated for a specified number of times. So for instance, you may see a pattern with the front bracket, and it says YO, which means yarn over, comma, K2 TOG, which is knit 2 together. And then you'll see you'll see the closing bracket and then the number after it. Like here, this example I'm using, there's an 8. So that means you would do a yarn over, knit 2 together, and then you repeat that 7 more times. And you would have a total of 8 yarn overs and 8 knit 2 togethers, you know, alternating. So that's what that means. And parentheses is also used in the same way. Parentheses are used to indicate a group of stitches that are to be worked together as a stitch. So an example of this you may see in a pattern, open bracket, YO, which is yarn over, comma, K2 TOG, which is knit 2 together, and then close bracket and a number after it, where in my example 8. And what you would be doing is you would do a yarn over, then you would knit 2 together, and then you would repeat that 7 more times. So in total you would have 2 segments of, you would have 8 segments of yarn over, knit 2 together. So that's what that means. And then when it comes to parentheses, parentheses are used to indicate a group of stitches that are to be worked together as a stitch. And what I mean by this, an example of this is you might see open parentheses K1, comma, P1, comma, K1, close parentheses, in next stitch. So you would be working a knit one, a purl one, and a knit one all in the same stitch. And this makes what you call a popcorn stitch. So hopefully what I've shared with you today helps you when it comes to reading a knitted pattern. Another piece of advice I want to give y'all, and this is how I started to learn how to read patterns. Find a video tutorial that also has a written pattern. And Morley Bird's channel is awesome for that. That's who I learned a lot from, because her video tutorials always have a written pattern. And I would watch the video tutorial and look at the written pattern, and that's kind of where I learned how things are worded and how things work in a pattern. And I will put the link for Morley Bird's channel in the description box of this video. She also does crochet videos too. She's not just knitting. But yeah, I hope this video helps y'all on y'all knitting journey. And if y'all have any questions, feel free to ask. I hope y'all are all having a fabulous yarny day. Be the light, and bye.